Alright, so I'm standing here in front of a MiG-21. Now this aircraft was in service in the Finnish Air Force from the 1960s onwards, and it's a really special part in aviation history, not just for Finland, but pretty much aviation history as a whole. Now the story of the MiG-21s making it to Finland is more or less a political story. Now in the 1960s, early 1960s, this plane was pretty much state of the art. It was incredibly fast, it was one of the most modern aircrafts out there, and of course the Soviet Union guarded the MiG-21 pretty much for themselves. Now, with them guarding it for themselves, this meant that even countries in the Warsaw Pact, their allies kind of in Eastern Europe, didn't yet receive this aircraft. That took them a couple of years. However, Finland got them really early. In fact, Finland was the first country to use MiG-21s outside of the Soviet Union. And this is incredibly interesting and bizarre, really, because Finland was not an ally of the Soviet Union, but at the same time Finland was also not exactly an ally of the West. It was in a very peculiar spot, being just on the border of the Soviet Union, and it was a balancing act that had to be struck between the West and essentially East, the Soviet Union. Now what happened in the 1960s is that President Kekkonen went to the Soviet Union, and he, or at least the Soviets, already knew that Finland was looking for its next generation fighter aircraft. And they heard that the Finns had approached Sweden for some of the early versions of the Saab Draken. And in order to get maybe a little bit of influence on Finland, in order to stop them from going too far to the west, they offered the MiG-21. This is quite an offer, you gotta say. As I said, nobody had this aircraft except the Russians, the Soviets. Now the first MiG-21s that make it to Finland are MiG-21s F-13, so this is quite an early version. However, later on you would also get the MiG-21 bis, which was of course an upgrade to the earlier variants. It's quite an interesting story how Finland started to operate these as well. What happened is essentially that pilots were chosen. Some of these pilots already had experience flying, for example, the Vampire, and they were shipped off to the Soviet Union. They weren't told where they were going, they weren't told what they were supposed to do. They were just put on a train, off to the Soviet Union you go. And they ended up, after a couple of days of trip, in Kyrgyzia. And over there, they ran into Soviet pilots, instructors. Now this is when a sort of language barrier problem developed, because the Russians didn't speak Finnish and the Finns only spoke a little bit of broken Russian. But eventually they could more or less explain how these aircrafts work to the Finns. Now during this time, there's two very interesting things that happen. First of all, one morning, the Finnish pilots that are supposed to be training on the MiG-21s that day find that the barracks and the airfield is essentially deserted. All the instructors left. They don't know where they are, nobody has told them anything, and after a couple of days these guys come back and they don't really explain a word. But later on the Finnish pilots realized that there was a thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and these instructors had been pulled out of the base probably because of this little incident. Now one other little piece of trivia that comes from that time when the Finnish pilots were training in the Soviet Union to become MiG-21 pilots is that on one of the days they suddenly saw a flash on the horizon, and it turned out that the Soviet Union had in fact tested an atomic bomb more or less in the vicinity, obviously quite a few hundred kilometers away, but close enough for the pilots to notice the flash. And the sad part of that story is that apparently a lot of the pilots that were then later on MiG-21 pilots actually died of cancer. So that might actually in fact be related, and it gives a little bit of a sad twist to the story, really. But the MiG-21 is an incredible aircraft for its time. It's extremely fast, and it came as a shock to everybody, really, that Finland... Oh, the sun is coming out. That's beautiful. You get a better shot now. But yeah, it came as a shock to everybody that Finland suddenly had this amazing kind of fighter, whereas before they essentially had to do with outdated Vampires at that point when they got them in the mid-50s. and they really had operated second-rate aircraft ever since World War II. And with the MiG-21, they were back in business. And it's really a fascinating tale, really, of aviation history, but not just aviation history, but how politics really influences sometimes the capability that an Air Force has. And of course, you can see the Finnish roundel. This was the Finnish roundel that they received after World War II. Obviously, the symbol they had before that had fallen out of favor with the world, even though it had nothing to do with the symbol that we associate to that time frame. And we also have the serial number MG135. Now, interestingly enough, actually, is that the aircraft that the Russians wanted to avoid Finland of getting, that's the Saab Draken, ended up being in this Finnish Air Force as well. And later on, about half of the Finnish Air Force was composed out of these MiG-21s, and half of it was the Saab Draken. But that's a story for another time. I hope you like the look of this MiG-21. Now, I hope that you enjoy this look at the MiG-21 in the Finnish Air Force. And I want to give special thanks here to the Finnish Aviation Museum for having welcomed me, and especially Valeri, who has gone into detail with so many of the aircraft they have here, over 80 aircraft in their exhibition, and he's really explained so much detail and stuff that I myself didn't know, and especially the things that he told me about the MiG-21 and its significance for Finland is quite astonishing. In the description box below this video, you'll find a lot of information of the Finnish Aviation Museum. You'll find their website, their social media, and their YouTube channel. They already have a couple of videos uploaded as well. Make sure you check that out. They really have some very, very interesting stuff. And some of the aircraft they have here are one of a kind and extremely important in aviation history. Now, if you want to support my content a little bit more and essentially make videos such as this one possible, why not check out on Patreon? On Patreon, you can make small contributions each month to allow me to visit museums such as this, get new resources for my video, and then also buy the equipment that I need. Now, as always, I hope that you guys have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.